Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and solve by square roots. So ultimately what you want to remember is that you need to isolate the squared term. So when I say you want to isolate the squared term, that means that you want to either get x squared by itself, it's going to be x squared, or you want to get parentheses squared by itself. So we actually will not be foiling here. That's a pretty big shock here for Papa 2. We always are foiling, but this is one case where we won't. So I need to recognize the squared term. In example A here is this x squared. So I need to solve the equation. I need to get x squared by itself. So we'll go ahead and add 15 to each side. So now I have 2x squared is equal to 80. Now the square term is not by itself because the x is not by itself. I still have that 2. So divide by 2. So now I have x squared equals 40. So once I've isolated that square term, then I solve. Now today's lesson is solve by square roots. So what do you think we're going to do? We're going to take the square root of each side. Now we have only simplified radicals so far today, so when you simplify a radical, you just assume that the answer is positive. However, we know that if you square positive 2, or whether you square negative 2, you're always going to get a positive 4. So these x squareds, these quadratics, will always have two answers. You're always going to have to do a plus or minus when you take a square root. So my answer here is going to be plus or minus the square root of 40. Now, of course, we're not done yet. We have to simplify this radical. So 40, what we're doing is we're breaking it down. So 40 is like 4 times 10. 4 breaks down to 2 times 2. 10 breaks down to 2 times 5. So you're looking for those groups of 2. So that means that 2 is what comes on the outside. And then this 2 and this 5 are going to stay on the inside. So when we write our answer, okay, the plus or minus is coming before that radical 40, and our radical 40 is turning into 2 radical 10. That 10 came from multiplying the 2 times 5. So there's our answer. I think Buzz wants you to type it in from least to greatest, so just watch those directions. Now looking at B, same idea, you want to get that x squared by itself. So this one starts off pretty simple. You're just going to subtract 11 from each side. So x squared equals negative 9. So here what we just want to refresh your memory about is that when you take the square root of a negative, because now you totally can, okay, you're going to want to do plus or minus. And then the square root of negative means we're going to have an I in our answer, and the square root of 9 is 3. So our answer is going to be plus or minus 3i, and that's it. Okay, a couple more here. So if you look at example C, this one's totally different because now my squared term is the parentheses, is that x minus 4. So I'm not going to FOIL that. What I'm going to do is I have to get that x minus 4 by itself. So I have to get rid of everything else. Don't try to add to it. So the first thing that means I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll add 1 to each side. So 1/3 times x minus 4 squared equals 11. And then I have to get rid of that 1/3. So to get rid of that 1/3, I'm going to think about multiplying by the reciprocal so that this cancels out. And now I'm going to be left with x minus 4 squared. Do not distribute that. So x minus 4 squared equals 33. Once we have that squared term by itself, we establish that x minus 4 is a squared term. Now we can go ahead and take the square root. So when I take the square root, on the left side I'm left with x minus 4. On the right side I'm left with plus or minus the square root of 33. Because we physically took the square root, that means we have to have a plus or minus. Now what I'm going to do is I have to finish solving for x. I haven't actually done that. So I'll add 4 to each side. Now when we add 4, we're not actually adding the 4 to the square root of 33. You can't make that the square root of 37. That's no bueno. So my answer is actually going to be x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 33. So that 4 actually has to go in front of the plus or minus because it's not a plus or minus 4, it's just a plus 4. And it's a plus 4 because we added 4 to each side. So that's my answer. So let's try D, another one. Practice makes perfect, right? So here's this x squared, that's my squared term, that's what I need to get by itself. So I'll subtract 18. So now I have 2x squared equals negative 90. Divide by 2. X squared equals negative 45. Square terms by itself. That's the green light to take the square root. So the reason why we have this example here is because the square root of x squared is x, but now on the right side, notice that we have that negative inside our radical. So we want to make sure we're practicing a little bit with those imaginary numbers. So we have a couple things going on here. 1, square root means we're going to have a plus or minus. 2, we need to break down this radical. 45 can simplify. 33 could not. It was just 3 times 11. Those are both prime numbers. But 45 is 9 times 5. And 9 breaks down to be 2 3s. So ultimately, we have a pair that comes out. So that 3 is going to come out, but it's going to be after the plus or minus. So plus or minus 3. I'm going to need that I. Don't forget that I because of this negative that's in here. And then I need this 5 that's inside the radical because it doesn't have any sort of match. So my answer there, let's make it nice and clear, plus or minus 3i radical 5. Okay, so this is going to be our last example before we go ahead and do our word problem. So now, again, we have a parentheses squared here. So not just an x squared, this time we have an x plus 4 squared. So I have to get rid of that. Remember, we're not FOILing. We're definitely not distributing that 3. What we're going to go ahead and do is divide by 3 on each side. So now when I do that, those are going to cancel out, and I'm left with x plus 4 squared equals 25. So now I've got that x plus 4. I've got that squared term isolated. That's giving me the green light to go ahead and take the square root. Now the nice thing about this problem is, what do you see is happening on the right side? That square root of 25 is totally a perfect square. So first of all, this is the super most important thing. Don't forget your plus or minus. So many people forget the plus or minus just because it's a perfect square and you're going to get a regular plain old 5. Now, don't want to do any bad math. Remember, if that was the square root of 5, we would subtract 4 from each side and we wouldn't combine those. We would put that 4 in front of the plus or minus. So we got to do the same thing. So I want to go ahead and do that. I want you to see that if we're subtracting 4 from each side, this is really x equals negative 4 plus or minus 5. When you have a situation like this though, sometimes it helps to break it out and write it as x plus 4 equals positive 5 and x plus 4 equals negative 5. Ultimately, these are the same things, but when you subtract them, here I get x equals 1, and here I get x equals negative 9. Same thing here. I have negative 4 plus 5, which is 1, and negative 4 minus 5, which is negative 9. Sorry, guys. So my two answers here are going to be negative 9 and 1, no matter how you do that. So we have two distinct answers. Make sure you actually do the math. Alright, so this is our word problem. It says, if you drop an object from 240 feet high, how long will it take the object to hit the ground? So we're going to give you this equation. This is the height function. This is like the acceleration of gravity, something physics like that. What you need to know is that h is in feet, because our problem's in feet. T represents time. We're talking time in seconds. And h sub 0. So h sub 0 is this guy right here. That's your initial height. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, how long will it take for this object to hit the ground? Well, I basically want to know how long it's going to take when height is equal to 0. So not when time is equal to 0. I'm not plugging in 0 for t. I'm making this whole thing right here. That's 0. Okay, the height after some amount of time is 0 feet. And that is going to be equal to negative 16 t squared plus 240. Now that 240, that's my initial height. That's going to be my 240, my starting height. So now I'm going to solve this. Now I'm going to solve this using square roots because that's the section that we're doing. So that means I want to get the t squared by itself. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract the 240. So now I have negative 240 equals negative 16 t squared. Now this works out nicely because I'm going to divide by that negative 16. Okay, so that means that that's going to become positive. So I'm going to get a 15 there. So now I have t squared equals 15. Now if I would have gotten negative, we can't really have an imaginary amount of time, so we would have known that it was impossible. What we do need to understand here is that my next step, since the t squared is by itself, is to take that square root. So when I do that, now I have that t equals plus or minus the square root of 15. Two things. One, we're talking about time. So you don't talk to people like, hey, I'll be there in the square root of 15 minutes. Okay, you tell them I'm going to be there in about 3 minutes or whatever. So here, we're going to actually make this into a decimal. So go ahead and type that into your calculator, and you're going to get plus or minus 3.87. So we'll just round to 2 decimals there. Now, can you have a negative time? No. So we're going to reject the negative, okay? When doing word problems, a lot of times you reject that negative. So our answer is actually only the positive 3.87 seconds.